It popped up in my inbox at 3:24 a.m., an aerial shot of my beachfront property. The subject line read, "Conceptual Mock-up." Beneath the photo was a glossy overlay showing sleek white cabanas, infinity pools, and fire pits where my grandmother's rose garden used to be. At first, I thought it was spam. Then I saw the sender, Greg. My heart slammed into my ribs. I called him immediately, forgetting it was the middle of the night. When he answered, his voice was groggy but laced with that smug edge I recognized too well. "You like it?" he asked, as if we were chatting about a gift he'd wrapped for me. "Are you insane?" I hissed. "What the hell is this?" "A business proposal," Greg said casually, as though it wasn't the most absurd thing in the world to send me a mock-up of my own property being gutted and replaced with some kind of Instagram influencer paradise. "I've already got investors interested." "This could be huge, Jenny." "Wait," I interrupted, my voice shaking. "You've shown this to people?" "Of course." He laughed, like I'd asked if the sky was blue. "It's called marketing." I needed to pitch the idea, see how it landed. "You don't even own the house." I snapped, my nails digging into the edge of the kitchen counter. "I said no, Greg." "No means no." "Relax," he said, his tone annoyingly condescending. "Nothing's set in stone. But think about it. The beach house is sitting there empty most of the year, and this could be a game changer for both of us." "There's no us in this equation," I shot back. "The house is mine, and you had no right." "Don't be dramatic, Jenny," he cut me off. "It's just business." I didn't sleep that night. By the time the sun came up, I was on my way to the beach house, determined to shut this nonsense down in person. My hands were trembling on the wheel as I played through every possible confrontation scenario. Greg would probably act like this was all a misunderstanding, like I'd overreacted. That was his usual move, calm and dismissive, as if his arrogance was somehow my fault. But when I pulled into the driveway, it was worse than I expected. A large truck was parked on the gravel, its bed filled with tools, lumber, and steel stakes. Several workers in neon vests were unloading equipment, their voices carrying over the gentle crash of the ocean waves. They moved with purpose, as if this project had been planned down to the minute. I barely waited for my car to come to a full stop before jumping out. "What are you doing here?" I demanded, marching up to the man holding what looked like blueprints. He was tall, with a sunburned face and the weary look of someone who didn't get paid enough for arguments. "Good morning to you too," he said, glancing at me before returning his attention to the plans. "This is private property," I snapped. "Who authorized this?" "Greg Sterling," the man replied, flipping a page. "He said you'd approved the work." My stomach churned. "Well," he lied. "I didn't approve anything. Pack up your stuff and leave." The man sighed, finally looking me in the eye. "I get it. Family miscommunication happens. But we're on a tight schedule here. Greg showed us the permits yesterday. Everything's been cleared by the county." "Permits?" There was no way Greg had gotten permits. "Where are these permits?" I asked. He shrugged. "With the project manager, probably. I can't leave until I get the word from him or Greg." I stood there, seething, as the workers continued unloading. Every hammer and shovel felt like a slap in the face. I needed to get Greg on the phone, but I knew what would happen. He'd stonewall, justify, and double down. I grabbed the foreman's clipboard. He protested, but I ignored him, scanning the documents clipped to it. There was a work order signed by Greg, along with some kind of architectural render. My grandmother's house looked like a completely different building. The wraparound porch? Gone. Her handmade shutters? Replaced with sliding glass panels. Even the garden, her pride and joy, was covered in paving stones. "Unbelievable," I muttered, slamming the clipboard back into the man's chest. I called Greg, pacing furiously across the gravel. He picked up on the third ring, his voice infuriatingly casual. "Jenny, good morning," he said. "Are you kidding me, Greg? There's a construction crew at my house right now. You forged permits." "I didn't forge anything," he said, his tone sharp. "I expedited the process. It's perfectly legal." "You expedited permits for property you don't own?" I barked. "You've lost your damn mind. Call them off now." Jenny, relax, he said, as if I were being unreasonable. This is for both of us. You'll thank me later when you're raking in passive income and sipping margaritas on a yacht. Greg, I'm not playing games with you. If they're not gone in the next hour, I'm calling the police. You'd really do that? His voice darkened. Call the cops on your own brother? That's cold, Jenny. Especially after everything I've done for this family. What you've done? I laughed bitterly. You mean your constant schemes that Mom and Dad bailed you out of? The way you let everyone else clean up your messes? Yeah, you're a real hero, Greg. There was a long pause, and I thought he might finally give in. But then he said something that chilled me to the bone. You're being short-sighted, he said flatly. This deal is happening, whether you like it or not. And if you try to stop me, you'll regret it. He hung up before I could respond. I stood there, stunned, as the crew carried on like nothing had happened. This wasn't over. I didn't know how yet, but I was going to fight back. I didn't waste time. The moment Greg hung up, I started taking photos of everything, equipment, workers, the torn-up garden, even the mock-up drawings pinned to a board near the truck. My anger kept me focused, fueling each step as I documented every detail. Once I had enough, I left the property and drove to the county office, determined to verify Greg's so-called permits. The clerk at the counter looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language when I explained the situation. She tapped at her keyboard for a few minutes before finally glancing up. I'm not seeing any recent applications under your name, she said. What about under Greg Sterling? She typed again, then frowned. Nothing under that name either. Are you sure these permits exist? He told me they're approved, I said, my frustration bubbling over. There's a construction crew on my property right now because of them. If you have a copy of the permits, I can look up the details, she said. I don't have them. The construction foreman does. Then I'd suggest you get a copy, she said simply. I clenched my fists, fighting back a retort. She wasn't the problem. Greg was. Still, I left the office feeling like I'd hit a wall. Back in my car, I scrolled through the photos I'd taken. The permits were there, just blurry enough that the details couldn't be read. I cursed under my breath, realizing I'd have to return to the site and get better images. When I arrived, the workers were on a break, gathered near the truck. I marched straight to the foreman, who was leaning against the hood with a sandwich in hand. I need to see the permits, I demanded. Look, ma'am, he said, sighing. I get you're upset, but I'm not handing over paperwork without Greg's approval. You're working on my property, I shot back. You have no right to keep them from me. I have a job to do, he said, setting down his sandwich. If you've got a problem, take it up with Greg or the county. Fine, I said, pulling out my phone. The foreman was holding the clipboard in one hand, the other resting on the hood of the truck. I raised my phone and aimed it at the permits clipped to the top. Hey, he barked, reaching for it, but I stepped back quickly. You can't just take pictures of private documents. You're trespassing on my land, I said coldly. I can do whatever I need to protect my property. He muttered something under his breath, but I didn't stick around to hear it. I got in my car and left, the image of the permits sitting on my phone like a small victory. At home, I pulled the photo onto my computer, zooming in on the text. The permits looked real, official stamps, signatures, everything. But something caught my eye in the fine print. The applicant's name was listed as Greg Sterling, authorized agent for Jenny Sterling. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Greg had forged my authorization. It was the only explanation. But how? My name looked perfect, like I'd signed it myself. I racked my brain, trying to remember if I'd ever signed anything that could have been used against me. Then it hit me. A month ago, Greg had asked me to sign what he called routine paperwork for our parents' estate. He'd been charming, insistent, and I hadn't thought twice about it. I'd signed without even reading it, trusting him. That trust had just cost me. The next morning, I called my lawyer, explaining everything I'd uncovered. She didn't sound surprised. Unfortunately, this isn't uncommon, she said. Family members misuse powers of attorney all the time. If Greg had access to your signature, it wouldn't take much to fabricate an authorization form. So what do? I asked. We'll file a formal challenge to the permits, she said. It'll take time, But if we can prove your signature was forged, the permits will be voided. How much time? Depends on how quickly the county moves, she admitted. It could take weeks. Maybe longer. Weeks. I didn't have weeks. Every day, that crew was tearing apart my house. There has to be something faster, I said. You could file for an injunction, she said. But you'll need solid evidence. The county will want to see proof of the forgery. I've got a picture of the permits, I said. That's a start, she said. But you'll need more than that. I'd recommend hiring a forensic document examiner. If they can testify that the signature isn't yours, it'll strengthen your case. It sounded complicated and expensive, but I didn't see another option. I agreed, and within hours, she had connected me with an examiner. The next few days were a blur of paperwork and frustration. The examiner confirmed what I already knew. The signature wasn't mine, but Greg had done an annoyingly good job. He'd used my real handwriting samples to create the forgery, making it almost impossible to prove without expert analysis. Meanwhile, the construction continued. Each visit to the beach house felt like a punch to the gut. The garden was gone entirely, replaced by a gaping hole where the new foundation was being poured. Workers were everywhere, their trucks and equipment turning the once peaceful property into a chaotic mess. Greg didn't return my calls or texts. He was avoiding me, no doubt waiting for the project to be too far along for me to stop it. But he'd underestimated me. On the 5th day, I got a call from my lawyer. The forensic report was ready, and it was enough to move forward with an injunction. We filed the paperwork that same afternoon, requesting an emergency hearing. I showed up at the courthouse the next morning, nervous but determined. Greg was already there, sitting in the front row of the courtroom with his lawyer. He didn't look at me when I walked in, but I could feel his arrogance radiating across the room. The hearing was tense. My lawyer presented the evidence, laying out the forgery in painstaking detail. Greg's lawyer countered with excuses, claiming I was simply trying to sabotage a project I'd agreed to. The judge listened, his expression unreadable. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up, my hands shaking but my voice steady. This isn't just a legal matter, I said. It's personal. My brother betrayed me. He lied to me, manipulated me, and went behind my back to destroy something that means the world to me. This isn't about business, it's about trust. And he broke it. Greg finally looked at me then, his expression unreadable. When the judge announced his decision, I held my breath. In light of the evidence presented, he said, I'm granting the injunction. All construction activity must cease immediately until this matter is resolved in court. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Greg's lawyer immediately requested an appeal, and the judge granted it. As I left the courthouse, Greg caught up to me. You won this round, he said, his tone cold. But you won't stop me. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Because no matter how long it took, I wasn't giving up. Greg's threat outside the courthouse stuck with me. It wasn't the first time he'd tried to intimidate me, but this time felt different, colder, more calculated. I wasn't dealing with the brother I grew up with. This Greg was someone I barely recognized, and it was clear he wasn't going to stop unless I made him. The injunction had halted construction for now, but it didn't mean the fight was over. Every time I thought about the damage already done to the property, my frustration boiled over again. The torn-down garden, the disrupted foundation work, it was like a slow-motion robbery, and Greg had all but admitted he wouldn't stop until the house was completely transformed. I decided I needed more leverage. Greg had always been good at hiding the full extent of his schemes, but he wasn't perfect. Somewhere, there had to be evidence that could shut him down for good. I started by hiring a private investigator. Her name was Maria, and she came highly recommended. She wasted no time digging into Greg's business dealings, telling me she'd seen this kind of thing before, family members leveraging property and trust for personal gain. It was almost too common. If he's cutting corners, we'll find it, she said during our first meeting. Most people like your brother think they're untouchable, and that arrogance usually leaves a trail. While Maria got to work, I focused on gathering every piece of documentation I could about the beach house. I dug through old paperwork, looking for anything Greg might have used to forge the authorization for the permits. I found nothing unusual, but the act of searching kept me grounded. A few days later, Maria called with an update. "You were right," she said. "Your brother's up to his neck in debt. His business has been losing money for years. That's why he's so desperate to push this project through. He needs the payout to keep himself afloat." I felt a sick sort of vindication. Greg had always projected an image of success, expensive suits, luxury cars, fancy dinners. But it had been a facade. "Does he have other properties he's tied up in this?" I asked. "Not directly," Maria said. "But he's using his company to funnel money into this project. It's a risky move. If the project fails, it'll likely bankrupt him." That gave me an idea. If Greg's company was funding the project, there had to be a paper trail. I asked Maria to look for contracts, payments, anything that tied his company to the permits or construction work. In the meantime, I kept a close eye on the property. The construction crew had left after the injunction was issued, but the damage was still there. Seeing it every time I visited was a constant reminder of how far Greg had gone. I spent hours documenting everything: photos, videos, written accounts. If this went back to court, I wanted to be ready. Then Maria called with another breakthrough. "I found something," she said. "It looks like your brother's company signed a contract with the construction crew under your name." "What?" "They forged your authorization again," she explained. "The contract lists you as the property owner who approved the project, but the signature matches the one on the permits. Same forgery." I felt a rush of anger. Greg hadn't just forged my name once. He'd built the entire project on a foundation of lies. "This is enough to prove fraud, right?" I asked. "It's strong evidence," Maria said. "But it's not a slam dunk. You'll need to present it in court to get a definitive ruling." I forwarded the information to my lawyer immediately. She agreed that it strengthened our case, but we still had to navigate the legal system. Greg had filed an appeal against the injunction, and until that was resolved, everything was in limbo. Then Greg did something I didn't expect. He showed up at my house. It was late in the evening, and I almost didn't answer the door. But when I saw him standing there, I knew he wouldn't leave without a confrontation. I opened the door, crossing my arms as I stared him down. "What do you want, Greg?" He smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We need to talk." "About what?" "How you forged my name on legal documents. Or how you're destroying our grandmother's house." "I'm trying to save both of us," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "You don't see the bigger picture, Jenny. This project is going to change everything. For both of us." "You mean for you," I corrected. "You're trying to save yourself because your company's drowning in debt." His face darkened. "You've been digging into my finances?" "Maria has," I said, not bothering to hide the truth. "She's found plenty. Enough to ruin you if this goes to court." Greg laughed, but it was hollow. "You think you're in control here? You've got no idea how deep this goes. If you shut this down, I'm not the only one who'll lose. Those investors I brought in? They don't play nice when things fall apart." "Are you threatening me?" "I'm giving you a reality check," he said. "If you keep fighting this, you'll make enemies you can't handle." I stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. Greg wasn't just desperate, he was dangerous. He'd entangled himself with people who didn't care about family, ethics, or legality. They cared about results. "Get out of my house," I said coldly. He hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. "Fine. But don't say I didn't warn you." As the door closed behind him, I realized this was bigger than a family feud. Greg had dragged me into something far more serious than I'd anticipated, and I wasn't sure how far he, or the people behind him, would go to protect their investment. The next day, Maria called with more news. She'd traced one of the investors Greg had brought into the project. The man had a criminal record: fraud, extortion, even a few charges related to organized crime. "This isn't just a business deal," Maria said. "This guy operates in the shadows. If your brother's working with him, you need to be careful." I felt a chill run through me. Greg wasn't just lying, cheating, and stealing, he was playing with fire. And now I was caught in the flames. Greg's words rattled around in my head for days. "If you keep fighting this, you'll make enemies you can't handle." I didn't want to believe he meant it, but everything Maria had uncovered painted a different picture. Greg had always been reckless, but working with someone tied to organized crime was another level of dangerous. I tried to focus on the legal fight. My lawyer assured me we had a strong case, but the appeal process was moving slowly. Every delay felt like a win for Greg. Meanwhile, Maria kept digging, hoping to find a way to cut through the red tape and force a faster resolution. Then the first rail warning came. It was early morning when I stepped outside to grab the mail. My driveway was empty except for my car, but as I approached the mailbox, I saw a folded piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper. My stomach twisted. I unfolded the note carefully. The message was short and written in thick, blocky letters. Drop the case or you'll regret it. I stared at the words, my pulse pounding in my ears. My first instinct was to call the police, but what could I say? It wasn't exactly a direct threat. No fingerprints, no witnesses. It would go nowhere. Instead, I called Maria. She showed up that afternoon, her face grim as she examined the note. This isn't surprising, she said. Guys like Greg's investor don't take kindly to obstacles. What do I do? Stay cautious. Watch your surroundings, don't take any unnecessary risks. And if anything else happens, call me first. Maria's calm demeanor helped, but only a little. That night, I double-checked all the locks on my doors and windows. I started sleeping with my phone on the nightstand and a baseball bat within reach. For a few days, nothing else happened. Then Greg made his next move. I got a call from my lawyer one morning, her voice tight with urgency. Jenny, we have a problem. Greg's filed a counterclaim against you. A counterclaim? For what? He's arguing that you're sabotaging his business and defaming him, she explained. He's demanding damages for the delays caused by your injunction. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He's the one who forged my name. How can he even make that argument? It's a legal strategy, she said. He's trying to muddy the waters and make you look unreasonable. It's a pressure tactic. Can he win? Unlikely, but that's not the point. He's trying to drain your resources and drag this out until you give up. Greg was doubling down, and I had no choice but to keep fighting. My lawyer filed a response, laying out the evidence of the forgery and fraud. Still, the added stress and expense weighed on me. Maria wasn't surprised by Greg's move. He's cornered, she said. He knows his best chance is to wear you out. What about his investor? I asked. If Greg fails, doesn't that hurt him too? It does, Maria said. But guys like him always have backup plans. If Greg goes down, the investor will cut his losses and move on. He won't hesitate to burn anyone who gets in his way. That thought stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Greg had put himself, and by extension, me, in a no-win situation. The investor wouldn't let this end cleanly, no matter what happened in court. A week later, I found out just how far they were willing to go. I was driving home from the grocery store when I noticed a black SUV following me. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, but the SUV stayed behind me for miles, turning down every street I did. My pulse quickened. I tried shaking them off, taking random turns and doubling back, but the SUV stayed close. Finally, I pulled into a crowded parking lot and parked near the entrance of a hardware store. The SUV idled for a moment before driving off. I sat there, heart racing, trying to convince myself it was nothing. When I got home, Maria called with another update. I traced Greg's investor further, she said. Turns out he has a history of intimidation tactics. People who cross him tend to back down fast. Great, I muttered. So what does that mean for me? It means you need to stay alert, Maria said. If they think you're close to winning, they might escalate. Escalate. The word sent a chill down my spine. The next morning, I found my car keyed from front to back. The damage was deep, the paint scraped away in long, jagged lines. My first instinct was to call Greg, but I knew it wouldn't matter. He'd either deny it or deflect, pretending he had no idea what I was talking about. Instead, I took photos and sent them to Maria. She didn't seem surprised. Document everything, she said. If this goes further, we'll need to show a pattern of harassment. The final straw came 2 days later. I was walking out of the courthouse after another frustrating hearing when a man approached me. He was tall and muscular, dressed in a plain black jacket. "You're Jenny, right?" he asked. "Who's asking?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You should reconsider this whole fight with your brother. Some things aren't worth the trouble." My hands clenched into fists. "Is that a threat?" "Just some advice," he said, still smiling. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. I called Maria immediately, recounting the encounter. "This is getting out of hand," I said. "I agree," she said. "We need to take this to the police. Even if they can't do much, it's important to have a record." That night, I filed a report, but it felt like a drop in the ocean. The officer I spoke to seemed sympathetic, but admitted they couldn't do much without more concrete evidence. Greg's fight had officially spiraled into something far beyond a family dispute. I wasn't just fighting for the beach house anymore. I was fighting to protect myself from people who didn't play by any rules. I wasn't going to back down, but the stakes had never been higher. 2 days after filing the police report, Maria called with urgency in her voice. "Jenny, we need to meet," she said. "I've uncovered something, but it's too sensitive to discuss over the phone." I agreed, and we met that evening at her office. She closed the door behind me and immediately handed me a stack of documents. "These are financial records from Greg's company," she said. "I found them buried in an old filing system. It's not just about the beach house. He's using your property as collateral for multiple loans he can't repay." My stomach sank. "What happens if he defaults?" "The banks and investors could seize the house," she said. "It's illegal since he doesn't own it, but untangling it through the courts would take years. You'd lose access in the meantime." It felt like a punch to the gut. Greg had gone beyond forging my name. He was gambling with my entire future. "How do we stop this?" I asked. "We need to expose him," Maria said. "If we can prove the fraud to his lenders and investors, they'll pull out and his entire operation will collapse. But it's risky. He won't go down quietly." Risky was an understatement. If Greg's backers found out I was the one who exposed him, they might come after me even harder. But what choice did I have? If I did nothing, Greg would bleed me dry until there was nothing left. Maria started preparing the evidence, carefully documenting every connection between Greg's lies and his financial dealings. It took days of nonstop work, but by the end, we had a clear picture of his scheme. He'd promised investors massive returns based on projections that were entirely fabricated. The beach house was the cornerstone of his plan, a shiny bait to lure in big money. Once we were ready, Maria helped me draft a letter to Greg's largest investors. It was simple and factual, laying out the evidence of fraud and warning them that continuing to fund Greg's projects could expose them to legal consequences. The first response came within 48 hours. One of the investors, a large firm, pulled out immediately, citing concerns over project integrity. It was a huge blow to Greg, and I knew it wouldn't take long for him to retaliate. Sure enough, the next day, he showed up at my house, banging on the door like a lunatic. "Open up, Jenny," he shouted. "We need to talk." I didn't budge. I stood by the window, watching as he paced on the porch, his face twisted in anger. After several minutes, he stopped, pulled out his phone, and made a call. Moments later, mine rang. "You think this is a game?" Greg's voice was venomous. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I stopped you from destroying my life," I said calmly. "You've ruined everything," he snapped. "Do you know what happens when people lose money because of you? They don't just walk away." "That's your problem, Greg," I said. "Not mine." He let out a bitter laugh. "You don't get it, do you? You've made yourself a target. These people don't care about family squabbles. They'll come after anyone who costs them money. And I won't be able to stop them." "Then you should have thought about that before dragging me into your mess," I said. "Get off my property, Greg. We're done." "Jenny, leave, or I'm calling the police," I said, cutting him off. For a moment, I thought he might try to force his way in, but then he turned and stormed back to his car. The next few days were tense. I stayed at a friend's house, too paranoid to sleep at home. Maria worked tirelessly, forwarding the evidence to the remaining investors. One by one, they pulled out, leaving Greg with no funding and a pile of debt. But the pressure didn't stop there. I started receiving anonymous calls, strange, silent ones that hung up as soon as I answered. Once, I came home to find my front door slightly ajar, though nothing was missing. Maria urged me to report everything to the police, but the officers seemed skeptical. Without concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could do. Then, late one night, I heard someone outside my window. I froze, heart pounding, as I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by the bed. Peeking through the blinds, I saw a shadowy figure standing by the tree line, just out of reach of the porch light. I called the police, my voice shaking as I described the situation. By the time they arrived, the figure was gone, leaving nothing but footprints in the dirt. The officer who responded looked concerned, but said what they always said, "We'll file a report, but without more, it's hard to act on this." I knew it wasn't enough. The next morning, Maria called with an idea. "We need to hit Greg where it hurts," she said. "If we can prove he knowingly involved dangerous individuals in his schemes, it could open up a criminal investigation." "How do we do that?" I asked. "By talking to his crew," she said. "Someone on that construction team knows more than they've let on. If we can get one of them to flip, it might be the break we need." It was a long shot, but it was better than sitting around, waiting for something worse to happen. Maria tracked down one of the workers, a younger guy named Chris who'd recently quit the project. She arranged a meeting, offering him confidentiality in exchange for information. At first, Chris was reluctant. He didn't want to get involved, but after some gentle prodding, he admitted that Greg's investor had been on site several times, personally overseeing parts of the project. He didn't trust Greg to handle it alone, Chris said. Kept talking about keeping everyone in line. He gave off a bad vibe. Chris also mentioned overhearing a conversation between Greg and the investor. They were arguing about money, Chris said. Greg was begging for more time, and the guy told him to fix it or it's over. I didn't stick around to hear the rest. Maria recorded the statement and forwarded it to the authorities. It wasn't much, but it was enough to spark an investigation. Within weeks, Greg's investor was subpoenaed. The investigation gained momentum, but Greg wasn't going down quietly. One evening, he showed up at Chris's workplace, desperately trying to buy his silence. When that failed, he sent his investor's men to talk to Chris. But Chris had been smart. He'd recorded everything, giving us even more evidence of intimidation. The day of Greg's arrest, I watched from my car as they led him out of his office. He caught my eye just before they put him in the police car. For a moment, I saw something I hadn't seen in years: fear. Real fear, not the kind he used to manipulate others. 3 months later, I stood in what remained of my grandmother's garden. The construction damage had left deep scars, but new growth was pushing through. As I planted the first rose bush, the same variety she'd loved, I thought about Greg sitting in a cell, waiting for sentencing. Mom called yesterday asking if I'd visit him. "He's still your brother," she'd said. But the brother I knew died the moment he decided to destroy our grandmother's legacy for profit. The restoration would take time, both for the house and for me. But as I watched the sunset from the wraparound porch, I realized something. Greg had tried to turn this place into a paradise for strangers, but it had always been my paradise. My home. My heritage. And now, finally, it was safe. Some things couldn't be bought, sold, or stolen. Some things just had to be protected, no matter the cost.